Namaste everyone. I am Prasad Dawadi, a student of MPhil second semester at Nepal Open University. Today I am going to deliver my virtual presentation on critical pedagogy, a look at major concepts. This is a text written by Peter McLaren. Let me present the key concepts or presentation highlights first. This is the presentation highlights. First, I'll be defining the concept of critical. Then I'll talk about the notion of critical pedagogy, critical education, why we need critical education, then importance of theory, critical pedagogy and social construction of knowledge, the form of knowledge, class and culture. Similarly, I'll be talking about the concept of dominant culture, subordinate culture and subculture, cultural forms, hegemony, ideology and prejudice, critical pedagogy and power or knowledge relation. I'll be talking about the concept of discourse as well, critical pedagogy and curriculum, the hidden curriculum, curriculum as a form of social politics, critical pedagogy and social production, and at last I'll talk about the concept of cultural capital. Now, let me say something about the concept of critical itself. Simply, the term critical refers to the practice of exercising or involving careful judgment or judicious evaluation of something. It is a fair and careful judgment about the good and bad aspect of existing approaches and practices. A critical thinker does not take anything for granted. In the context of critical pedagogy, a critical reader or critical educator is such a person who does not accept what is given, what is imposed upon him or her. There are some synonymous terms related to critical. Here the term is used in the sense of critical theory, critical pedagogy, critical literacy, critical applied linguistics, similarly critical language awareness, liberatory education, social justice education, education for equity, transformative practice, empowerment praxis, and so on. So critical or critical theory challenges the constructs such as naturalism, rationality, and neutrality. It assumes that knowledge is not necessarily neutral. All practices are shaped by ideology and nothing is neutral. In the course of teaching learning practice, it assumes that pedagogy and practices go hand in hand. Learning is never value free, it is always value laden. Knowledge imparted to the students is ideological and it is negotiated. Most of the time, the dominant practical political discourse influences the educational plans, policies, and practices. Now, let me say something about critical pedagogy. The theory of critical pedagogy is rooted in the works of Paulo Freire, McLaren, and bell hooks. Simply, critical pedagogy is concerned with social action and educational change. It aims to empower the learners, the people, to change the oppressive conditions in their lives. As Paulo Freire says, it assumes that education is the practice of liberation, emancipation from all sorts of oppression. In the classroom, the learners are empowered to raise questions and not to take anything for granted. Critical pedagogy assumes that teaching is inherently a political act. Knowledge can never be neutral. Social justice and democracy are not distinct from teaching. So the purpose of teaching is to support social justice and democracy. There must be praxis, which is the cycle of critical reflection and reflective action, bringing transformation in the classroom. Education is taken as dialogic process, the dialogue between the teacher and the students, dialogue between the students. Education is a process of empowering change, emancipating the learners, liberating them from the oppression. It assumes that theory and practice come together to bring action agenda for change. It advocates for extrojection, not the introjection. It advocates for open society, transformation, integration, and humanization. The critical theorists and researchers have examined how language shapes and reproduces power relations in society. They focus on transforming relations of power which are oppressive through language. It means oppressive practices are challenged, are questioned in pedagogical practices. Now, next concept is critical education. Simply, critical education refers to education for critical consciousness. It is the education to prepare critical educators, critical readers, critical teachers. The critical educators make transparent the complex relationship between majority and minority speakers and cultural groups. They are aware of different types of unfair practices such as linguistic imperialism, hegemony, and other discriminatory practices. In critical education, teaching cannot be isolated from students' imagination and intuition. Here we believe that pedagogy is shaped by socio-political realities of the society or the country. It is not detached from the political scenario of the country. Teachers and learners are supposed to be equally responsible for learning language. Teachers should be critical educators. They should be in favor of radical change in education and the society. These are some of the key concepts or the tenets of critical education. Now, why critical education is essential? As critical education aims to prepare critical readers, critical writers, critical educators, this type of education, this sort of education practice is necessary. We need critical education to deconstruct language and discourses in order to investigate whose interests they serve, whose interests language and discourses serve, and what messages are both explicitly and implicitly conveyed. Critical education aims to empower the learners through critically conscious teachers. Learners are guided by the critically conscious teachers. It aims to depart from banking model of education, which is more teacher-centered, which does not entertain the creativity of the learners. It aims to transform the system of language education and makes it more student-centered. Similarly, it aims to contribute to social justice, emancipation, and culture-sensitive language pedagogy. Now, why critical theory is important? There is a premise of critical theorist. The major premise is men and women are essentially unfree. They are not free. And they inhabit a world which is full of contradictions and asymmetries of power and privileges. So there is no symmetry in the society. There is no order in the society. There is hierarchy. There is inequality. There is discrepancy in the society. Theories are taken to be dialectical, and individual and society are supposed to be interwoven. And with the help of critical theories, we can focus on both sides of contradiction, the side of liberation as well as domination. Critical theories enable the school teachers to see school as a cultural landscape, cultural arena, or the territory of empowerment and self-transformation. So in the classroom, we can run the pedagogical activities in such a way that the students will be empowered, they will be critically conscious, they do not take anything for granted, they become able to raise question against injustice. This is school as a site of both domination and liberation. And critical theorists assume that any worthwhile theory of schooling must be partition. It must be oriented to bring change, to have fair practices everywhere. And there are two classroom objectives according to the concept of critical pedagogy. One is micro objective, next one is macro objective. The micro objective is also called productive knowledge. It represents the course content. It more focuses on the course content or the factual information only, whereas macro objectives center on the relationship between means and ends, between specific events and their wider political implications. It is also called directive knowledge. So micro objective is intended to produce productive knowledge, whereas macro objective is to have directive knowledge. These are two classroom objectives. Now, next concept is critical pedagogy and social construction of knowledge. Critical educational theorists view school knowledge as historically and socially rooted and interest bound. That knowledge serves the interest of the rulers, oppressors, or a particular dominant group. It is assumed that knowledge is never neutral. This has been mentioned earlier also. It is socially constructed, and it has connection with power relations, product of agreement or consent. But critical pedagogy asks about the whyness, howness, and whatness of knowledge. So whatever knowledge is presented in the classroom is not accepted unconditionally in critically run pedagogical practices. That is analyzed, critically studied, the pros and cons of that knowledge, the hidden ideology behind that knowledge, all these things are minutely analyzed, then only it is either accepted or rejected. So critical pedagogy is concerned with the relationship between social class knowledge, which is taught in school. It focuses on the value of scientific knowledge over informal knowledge. It also focuses on school knowledge and stereotypes. It goes against the stereotypical type of knowledge. It goes against all sorts of unfair knowledge, unfair distribution of knowledge, unfair pedagogical practices. Now, regarding the forms of knowledge, critical pedagogy follows a distinction regarding the forms of knowledge posited by German social theorist Jürgen Habermas. Here we talk about technical knowledge and practical knowledge. Technical knowledge is similar to zero productive knowledge. It is based on natural science. It is more factual and content based, whereas practical knowledge aims to enlighten the individuals, emancipate the individuals so that they can shape their actions in the world. It describes and analyzes social situations historically and developmentally. These types of knowledge helps the learners understand social events that are ongoing and that are situational. Malik, the critical educators are more interested in emancipatory knowledge, liberatory type of knowledge. And it is very similar to Zero's directive knowledge, which attempts to reconcile and transcend the opposition between technical and practical knowledge. Now, another notion is the notion of class. Here the class refers to economic, social, and political relationships that govern life in a given social order. Class relationships reflect the constraints and limitations individuals and groups experience in the areas of income level, occupation, place of residence, and other indicators of status and social rank. The pedagogical practices, classroom practices, are affected by the notion of class also. It depends on whether the pedagogy is in favor of the dominant class or dominated class. So a critical educator should know about various facets of the class and their presence in the classroom. So class relation deals with social distribution of power and its structural allocation. In critical pedagogy, we also talk about the notion of culture. Generally, we define culture as the totality of different values and assumptions that govern the way people think, behave, and communicate. Here, we focus on more than this. Here, the culture refers to the particular ways in which a social group lives out and makes sense of its given circumstances and conditions of life. Here, in critical pedagogy, culture and power are interlinked. We present culture as intimately connected with the structure of social relationships within class, gender, and age formations. Here, culture is analyzed not simply as a way of life, but as a form of production through which different groups define and realize their aspirations through unequal power relations. Culture is viewed as a field of struggle in which the production, legitimization, and circulation of particular forms of knowledge and experience are central areas of conflict. So even the notion of culture is critically evaluated or analyzed in critical pedagogy. Now, there is another concept of dominant culture, subordinate culture, and subculture. In critical pedagogy, we talk about three types of culture. The first one is dominant culture. It refers to the social practices and representations that affirm the central values, interests, and concerns of social class in control of material and symbolic wealth of the society. Subordinate culture refers to groups who live out social relations in subordination to the dominant culture, and subculture is the subset of the both these two, dominant culture and subordinate culture. These cultures are subcultures are involved in contesting the culture's space or opening in the dominant culture. Subcultures are more often negotiated than truly oppositional. They do symbolic critique of social order. We can see many subcultural movements that reflect a crisis within the dominant society rather than a unified mobilization against it. So subcultures may challenge the domination of dominant culture as well as the subordinate culture. Now, cultural forms. Here, the cultural forms refer to those symbols and social practices that express culture, which have developed from the efforts of groups to shape their lives out of their surrounding material and political environment. These cultural forms don't exist apart from set of cultural underpinnings which are related to the means of economic production, the mobilization of desire, the construction of social values, asymmetrics of power or knowledge, configuration of ideologies, and relations of class, race, and gender. So in critical pedagogy, the notion of cultural forms is also critically analyzed, whether these cultural forms are in favor of the oppressors or the oppressed, the dominant class or the dominated class. So which values they represent. We analyze this, we focus on this. Now, another very important concept is hegemony. Simply, the term hegemony refers to the maintenance of dominance through the consent of the ruled, consent of the subordinate group. It is the maintenance of the dominance through consensual social practices, social forms, and social structures produced in specific sites such as the church, the state, the school, the media, etc. In hegemony, we see a struggle in which powerful forces win the consent of those who are oppressed. So the oppressed people accept the domination, the rule of the oppressors. So it is a cultural encasement of meaning, a prison house of language and ideas that is freely entered into by both dominators and dominated. So it is the moral and intellectual leadership of a dominant class which is achieved by consent, not usually by coercion. So within the hegemonic process, the established meanings are often laundered of contradiction, contestation, and ambiguity. It means there is often the attempt to go against the hegemonic practice as well. And there is resistance that occurs often in the domain of popular culture. In such case, it becomes an arena of negotiation in which dominant, subordinate, and oppositional groups affirm and struggle over cultural representation and meaning. There will be competition among these groups for the representation of their meanings. The concept of CP or critical pedagogy states that not all prevailing values are oppressive. The critical educators also want to secure their hegemony for their own ideas. The challenge for teachers is to recognize and attempt to transform those undemocratic and oppressive features of hegemonic control that often structure everyday classroom existence. So the teachers should attempt to raise question against the hegemony, to aware the students of the hegemonic practices so that they become able to raise question, they become aware of how they how the oppressed class, how the ruled class take the domination of the rulers for granted. So the concept of hegemony, the concept of power, the concept of discourses, concept of suppression, oppression, domination, all these things should be taught. The students should be aware of all these aspects, all these notions in the classroom. That may be language classroom or other classroom. This is what the critical pedagogy, the concept of critical pedagogy says. Ideology is also an important notion in critical pedagogy. CP states that ideology pervades everywhere. It is found in all social life, and it is not only political. There are different types of ideology. It is the production and representation of ideas, values, and beliefs, and the manner in which they are expressed and lived out by individuals and groups. It is the production of sense and meaning, or a way of viewing the world. An ideology is the result of intersection of meaning and power in the social world. It is the framework of thought to explain and understand social and political world. A critical educator should aware the students or the learners of the role of ideology, the vested interest in found each and every ideology, and different types of ideology. An ideology has both positive and negative functions. Its negative functions are domination, legitimization, suppression, fragmentation, reification. Ideology may be used to justify the injustice done upon the poor people, marginalized people, disadvantaged group, or peripheral group. Ideology represents a vocabulary of standardization and a grammar of design sanctioned and sustained by particular social practices. The ideology may be dominant or oppositional. The dominant ideology refers to the patterns of beliefs and values shared by the majority of the individuals. It is more suppressive. The oppositional ideologies challenge the dominant ideologies. These are non-suppressive or non-repressive. Dominant ideology often encourages oppositional ideologies and tolerates those that challenge their own rationale. In the class of critical pedagogy, the teacher should see the functioning of privileging ideology, privileging or marginalizing practice in the class. So, ideology should not be taken for granted. The students are encouraged to raise question against the suppressive ideology, repressive ideology, or dominant ideology. Now, in critical pedagogy, the concept of prejudices is also important because critical pedagogy advocates against the prejudices. If there is negative prejudgment of individuals and groups on the basis of unrecognized, unsound, and inadequate evidences, it may result in unfair practice, discrimination, suppression, oppression. And because these negative attitudes occur so frequently, they may take on common sense or ideological character, and they may be used to justify the act of discrimination. So, prejudices are harmful. The learner should be made free from all these prejudices. They should be encouraged to have fair judgment, judicious judgment of each and everything. Now, next concept is critical pedagogy and the power-knowledge relationship. Critical pedagogy is fundamentally concerned with understanding the relationship between power and knowledge. Foucault's concept of power and knowledge is also implicational here, discussed here. Here, knowledge is presented as ideological construction. It is not value-free, it is value-laden. Knowledge is supposed to be produced by power. Foucault's concept of power or knowledge extends the notion of power beyond its conventional notion. As Foucault says, here also we accept that knowledge or power is pervasive. It is found everywhere. It does not necessarily come from the upper level of social structure. It circulates everywhere, and a critical educator should critically examine and make the students critically examine the role of knowledge and how knowledge is produced in the discursive practices. Now, another important notion is the notion of discourse. Here we don't take discourse only as the suprasentential unit of language. Discourse is associated with power. Power relations are inscribed in discourse or family of concepts. Discourses are discursive practices, or they are taken to be the products of discursive practices. For education, discourses can be defined as a regulated system of statements that establish a relation between fields and theories of teacher education. Discourse is embodied in the practice of institutions, patterns of behavior, and in the forms of pedagogy. Even the discourses may be dominant, repressive, or non-repressive. In the dominant discourses, we find the regime of truth that operates even in the class. Conservative discourses serve the interest of the rulers, whereas critical discourses judge everything critically. They focus on critical consciousness. They raise question against the unfair practices. Power, hidden interest, vested interest of the discourse generators. Here, truth is taken as relational, not relative, not absolute. So in critical pedagogy class, the teacher needs to know the connection between the politics and pedagogy. The teacher has to empower, has to produce empowering and emancipatory type of knowledge. So here we go against the banking concept of education. We go against the teacher-centered education. We focus on that education, that classroom pedagogy that empowers the learner, that emancipates the learners, that makes the learners raise question against all sorts of injustice, all sorts of domination, all sorts of repression, suppression, and so on. And regarding the curriculum, generally in traditional courses, curriculum also serve the interest of the rulers or the dominant groups. Curriculums may inferiorize the marginalized groups, peripheral groups. Mostly, curriculum represents much more than a program of study, a classroom text, or a course design. It may serve the interest of dominant, mostly, and sometimes dominated position also. The content, materials, textbooks may benefit dominant groups and exclude subordinate groups. Especially it happens in the traditional courses or non-critical courses which are not based on critical pedagogy. And there is a notion of hidden curriculum. The traditional courses, non-critical courses may be based on hidden curriculum. They may be used to support the interest of the suppressors, interest of the dominant groups, the rulers. They may directly or indirectly glorify the, the suppressors. Here the hidden curriculum refers to unintended outcome of the schooling process. It is a tacit ways in which knowledge and behavior get constructed outside the usual course materials and formally scheduled lessons. This kind of course may have unconscious preference to classism, sexism, racism, and all sorts of unfair practices, discriminatory ideologies. But critical education advocates against hidden curriculum. In critical pedagogy, we take curriculum as a form of cultural politics. It is a part of social political dimension of the schooling process. We talk about political consequences of interaction between teachers and students from dominant and subordinate culture. Here the school is not understood as a unitary, monolithic or ironclad system of rules and regulations. It is presented as a cultural arena or the terrain or the landscape characterized by varying degree of accommodation, contestation and resistance. So there will be discursive practice in the classroom. There will be action and reflection in the classroom. There will be interaction in the classroom. There will be cross question in the classroom. The students do not take anything for granted in the classroom based on critical pedagogy. The critical theorists want to develop a language of critique and demystification, empowerment and consciousness through education. Now next notion is critical pedagogy and social reproduction. The critical theorists believe that schools, especially traditional schools, persuade reproduction of social class. During the school, in the classroom, the learners from lower class are encouraged to be the learners of lower class. Learners of middle class are encouraged to be the learners of middle class, and the learners of high class are encouraged to be the learners of high class. So there is perpetuation or the continuation of the social class, perpetuate reproduction of the social class. Schools reproduce structures of social life through colonization. It is similar to colonization practice. Hierarchy is created. But the critical educators ask the question, how do schools help transmit this status, class positions of the wider society? Here the correspondence theorist asks how schools reflect wider social inequalities, whereas conflict and resistance theorists talk about partial autonomy for the learners, for the educators. Here the teachers can do no better than to create agendas of possibilities in their classroom. Here the teaching learning practices should be based on inquiry, critique, constructing, building social imagination. And critical pedagogy again focuses on emancipatory pedagogy and pedagogy for social transformation. And traditional pedagogy, which only focuses on the continuation or the perpetuation of the same class, perpetuation, let's say, of the reproduction of the social class. This is denied, this is rejected here. Now next concept, we are coming to the end of this presentation. The last but not the least, this concept is the concept of cultural capital. So this concept of cultural capital is associated with the idea of Henry Thoreau, cultural reproduction. It is the term used by Pierre Bourdieu French sociologist. It simply refers to the way of talking, acting, modes of style, moving, socializing, forms of knowledge, language, practices, values. So it incorporates all the social practices, social treasures, cultural treasures. It includes the cultural traits of the learners. And in the classroom, the question is, what sort of cultural capital is focused? Mostly in traditional classrooms, the cultural capital of the high class people, or the rulers of the suppressors, or the dominant group is focused. Those practices are focused. They are imposed to the learners. They are presented as the high cultural practices, valuable treasures, whereas the cultural practices of the peripheral groups, marginalized groups, suppressed groups are ignored. They are otherized. They are presented as inferior, subordinate. Here the critical educators should be conscious about this, should be aware of this, and present both culture, culture of the high class, cultural capital of the high class, as well as the social capital of the high class, as well as the let's say the oppressed class, peripheral class, should be given equal value. Both restricted codes and elaborated codes should be presented. The students should be encouraged. The students should be encouraged to evaluate, to use, to analyze both restricted codes and elaborated codes. In the traditional schools, the cultural capital of the marginalized students may be devaluated, and it is the job of the critical educators to present it positively, to present the cultural capital of the oppressed class or the marginal class positively. So uh, this is the presentation. Here mainly I focused on the major concept of critical pedagogy. This focuses on critical consciousness, education for critical consciousness. It focuses on liberation through education, raising, making the learners raise question against all sorts of unfair practice, suppression, oppression, domination. It is against the banking model of education. All these things are taken from these references. Mainly I went through the text of McLaren, Peter McLaren, Critical Pedagogy, a look at the major concepts. This is the completion of my presentation. I tried my best to make the concept clear. So I request you to put some feedback in the comment box of my YouTube channel. Thank you very much.